In 2017, I traveled the trail from St. Louis to the Pacific Ocean, and I've been deeply involved in Lewis and Clark ever since. We'll begin with our land management acknowledgement. We begin by acknowledging that we are gathered in the homeland of the Saguenay and Kalaalleq people. We are committed to respectfully sharing the history and contemporary culture of the indigenous people who lived and traveled through this land. We learn from many indigenous artists, elders, and organizations. We invite you to learn from and support them as well. I would like to introduce our speaker, Lee Silliman. Lee is a retired educator and museum employee living in Missoula. He was a Montana secondary level physics, chemistry, and mathematics instructor for 43 years, as well as part-time photo archivist for a county museum for 26 years. Since early childhood, he has nurtured a strong interest in the art and history of the 19th century American West. Utilizing his own photographs, the historic photos from the museum collections he managed, as well as vintage engravings that he purchased, Silliman has assembled and circulated numerous exhibits that have been displayed in more than 100 venues throughout Montana and 10 other states since 1988. His photographic subjects have included western ghost towns and mining remnants, Yellowstone National Park, backcountry landscapes, the Bob Marshall Wilderness, Native American ruins of the Southwest, southwestern landscapes, and early 20th century era remnants, and of course, bison. His most recent book was A Ride on the Infertile Regions, Yellowstone's First Tourists. He has presented many conference lectures, taught numerous workshops, and led 4 educational group tours. Silliman holds a bachelor's and master's degree from the University of Illinois. He is married and has 2 daughters. Lee, it's yours.
Thank you very much. And I want to make a promise to you that I'm going to speak loud enough for everybody to hear me in the back. I want hands to go up if I'm not projecting well enough. I want everybody to hear me. I guess that's because I think what I have to say is important, right? All right. Before I get started, I have a bibliography here of my favorite books on the American bison. There's another 24 back at home on my shelf, but I did bring 10 of my favorite ones up here. So you people that came in late, be sure to come up and grab a copy. I made 50 copies of this bibliography, and almost all these books are laying right here for you to examine. So we'll get started here. I want to preface this that I'm not going to be full of facts and figures. If you want to read all the nitty-gritty details, get library copies or buy used copies of these books here. You're going to see an awful lot of beautiful artwork illustrating the general flow of history of the American bison up until their near extinction. I cut it off then. It's going to be an hours-long program, and the saving of the bison is another program that you're going to have to get another speaker to do. So let's get started here. I lived for I grew up in Illinois, went to the University of Illinois, and I became fascinated with the American West when I was 11 years old. And I had the privilege of teaching for 5 years in Denton, Montana, in the middle of the Judith Basin, one of the more beautiful spots in Montana. Prairies, river breaks, and then ringed with mountains. And I actually lived like almost due south of the head bison there. Back, as you can see, I can recognize some of my favorite landmarks. There's Square Butte, Round Butte, and the Highwood Mountains. I've actually have climbed Square Butte and Round Butte. So Charlie Russell painted, I thought, a really beautiful picture of the American bison because the Judith Basin was a beautiful range for the bison. So let's see what I'm going to talk about. First of all, we're going to discuss the historic origins going way back many thousands of years. And then we're going to move forward to the natural enemies of the American bison, some of which you are aware of and maybe some you didn't think about. Then we're going to discuss the American bison in how they were hunted in pre-horse days before the Europeans landed with horses which spread throughout the West. We're also going to look at the early attempts to create artworks of the American bison. And then we're next going to discuss probably what you're already familiar with, but I wanted to cover it anyway, which would be the centrality of the American bison to Plains Indian culture. Then we're going to look at some of the specific hunting techniques that were available once the horse arrived back on the North American continent. And then we will finish up, or have one more section on the slaughter of the bison, mainly by white hunters in the 1860s and 70s, and then we'll finish up with an aftermath. Can I have a hand? Am I speaking loud enough for everybody in the back there? All right, that's good. Using my teacher voice. Okay, the predecessors of the American bison actually came from Asia. They evolved in Asia and went over the Bering Land Bridge, which of course was a land connection to Asia when the ocean levels were 200 to 300 feet lower than they are today. Animals and people could walk across from Asia to North America, and that's when the American predecessors, the predecessors of the American bison came to North America. So there is ample evidence that the Europeans were hunting bison, as this picture suggests. They had a different name there called aurochs. The caves of Europe have images of bison. They're not exactly like the American bison, but you can see they have the general characteristics. And in North America, up to 10,000 years ago, there were many species of mammals which went extinct. The mammoth and the mastodon went extinct. The saber-toothed tiger went extinct. The short-faced bear, the dire wolf. The horse was actually evolved in North America, and it went over the land bridge of the Bering Land Bridge and populated Asia and Africa. Those went extinct, but of course what survived was the American bison. Now, I find this very interesting that many tens of thousands of years ago, there was a very large subspecies of the American bison called the bison latifrons. And you see right here a diagram suggesting the size. On the right is the current North American bison, but look what the historic one was in its size. I don't think you'd want to mess around with the horns of the bison latifrons. Isn't that amazing how big they are? So in comparison, the modern bison, which is a one-ton animal, was actually much bigger. So I'd like to quote Dan Flores, who will be your keynote speaker tonight. He's an excellent author. And I think he summarized 10,000 years of history really well, and I'll read this. The modern buffalo had actually co-evolved as a new species in the presence of native people, who in turn had fashioned around the swelling herds the longest lived, sustained economy in continental history so far. Bison populations, grasslands, carrying capacity, and predation, including Indian populations and level of hunting stress, over more than 80 centuries of time had settled into a sustainable balance. In other words, the Native Americans, although they were preying upon the bison, were able to coexist and allow the bison to thrive for over 10,000 years. That is quite an accomplishment, extremely important. Now, when I began my study of the bison, I was amazed to discover that it had a much greater range than you might have thought. We think of the bison as a high plains creature, but I want you to look very carefully. It was actually east of the Mississippi. It was even east of the Allegheny Mountains in the foothills. It extended west of the Continental Divide. It extended into Mexico, and it went all the way up into Alaska. In fact, there are still wild bison up in Alaska on a native preserve. Now, because of the different looks between bison that were further north and up in the woods versus the plains, it was thought that these were subspecies to each other. I just looked on the internet, and DNA analysis suggests that they're really the same species. Looks don't mean necessarily that they're different. That's very true in the avian world. Birds can look very different, but yet have the same DNA. So anyway, they're basically the American bison, bison. Now, you remember I was mentioning to you that there were bison east of the Mississippi? Here is a book that details the extermination of the bison east of the Mississippi. This is a picture of the American bison painted by Mark Catesby in the 1750s. He came to what is now like South Carolina and Florida and the islands of the West Indies, and went back to England after a number of years here on this continent and created the first illustrated botanical and faunal compendium of American natural history forms. I'm very pleased to say that this is the oldest and one of the rarest pictures that I have in my exhibit. I hope you all have the opportunity, either with the Lewis and Clark program here in this convention, or on your own to go to Travelers Rest State Park. My exhibit of 45 vintage engravings of the American bison is on display there all summer long. And I really appreciate Molly Stockdale and the Travelers Rest Connection for sponsoring this exhibit. It's very beautifully matted and framed, and Miss Galen over here is the one that helped me hang it. It's pretty nice, isn't it, Galen? You all got to go out there, right?
Yes.
Yes. And I'll be putting out some of the original pictures. These are all vintage engravings. These are not modern reproductions. These are all printed and painted in the 1800s, and a few even from the 1700s. So I put in my plug for Travelers Rest in my show. All right, here's a painting that I found of buffalo even on the Columbia River Plateau. You don't really associate them with, east of the Mississippi or the west of the Continental Divide, but they were there. Here's a picture I found of Mexican hunters going after the American bison. So it is estimated that there were 30 to 60 million bison in the ecosystem when Columbus landed. I think that's quite a testament to the power of the species and the ability of native people to live in harmony and balance with this species and still extracting, the necessities of life from them. So I think we should honor them greatly. Now, a lot of the historic accounts talk about seeing tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of bison, as you look off from a high point over into the plains. Actually, they weren't one large herd. Most bison segregated themselves into a band of either anywhere from 50 to a couple of hundred. And as the case with so many of the larger ungulates, it was a cow that led the band. The bulls were around, especially at mating time, but they were not the leader of the band. The band followed a matriarchal cow, and that's one of the things that led to their demise, as we'll see near the end of the program. All right, part 2, the natural enemies of the bison. The bison's first line of defense was rapid flight. I remember reading in one of my history books that a hunter chased a bison that was running at full speed for a full 10 miles. Let's see you run full speed at 10 miles. That's a pretty effective means of defense. And what's nice about living in a herd, and this is true for more than just bison, when one individual senses a threat and raises the alarm and starts a flight, then everybody follows. It's not like we're all going to check it out. When the herd starts, when one or two or five start moving, they all start moving. So that herd mentality is also an important defense, because once one individual sees a threat, then generally the rest of the herd can take off. All right. The natural enemies of the bison most predominantly were wolves. They were by the dozens and hundreds following the herds, and obviously there's a balance between the need for wolves to kill bison to eat and the need for the bison to survive. And the bison quite often would form a circle and protect the ones that are inside if there was a large herd of wolves that could get them stopped if the flight didn't save them. So we see a lot of artworks. I love Charlie Russell. That's kind of one reason why I moved to Montana. I wanted to live in big sky country. I wasn't born here, but I got here as soon as I could. But I think this is a really beautiful example that Charlie made. Here's Catlin's depiction showing what was most often the case. The old and the infirm who couldn't keep up with the movement of the bison, or who couldn't flee at full speed for 10 miles, those were often the ones that were subject to predation by the wolves. So it was the young, the old, and the infirm that could be separated and then brought down. And so here's an example of some wolves trying to do that. And although the caloric reward was very high, 1,500 to 2,000 or more pounds of food, it was very risky, as this artist is depicting, because of the lethality of the bison's horns and their ability to kick. Now, this picture notwithstanding, and I find this true in my collection, I own over 1,500 pictures in my collection celebrating the art of the American West. Quite often, artists would depict something that wasn't quite accurate. It's not the case that that wolves would try to hit the head or the throat of a bull like this. That would be way too dangerous because of the horns. Most of the time, what you try to do is get the hamstrings on the back of the animal. That could bring it down, and then they have a chance. So it's a rear attack, not a frontal attack. Now, I'm not going to play this video, but if you go home and Google this, there's the actual words if you want to Google it right there. It's a video of a wolf pack trying to separate this calf right here. Not only were the infirm and the old subject to predation, but the young calves that were just born, a few weeks or a month old, they would try really hard to separate the calf. This is an excellent video because you can see that calf is like within a foot or two almost all the time with the cow. The calf stays near the cow, and the cow will use her horns and her feet to protect it. I won't tell you what happened. You're going to have to go home and watch, okay? I'm sorry. All right. Here's an unusual picture from my collection. Grizzly bears were preying upon bison calves. You are probably aware that the grizzly bear, you're all Lewis and Clark people, you know how they encountered the grizzly bear hundreds of miles before they got into the Rocky Mountains. The grizzly bear was a plains animal, and they did prey upon the calves of the bison. And I found this picture, I thought it was really interesting, showing a battle between a bear and the bison. I thought was particularly interesting is these two rattlesnakes are sure enjoying the show. And Charlie Russell painted this picture after hearing the description of this battle between a bison and a big grizzly bear. If I recall, at the end of the fight, both were wounded so badly that the hunter shot both of these animals. Here's another picture that I found in my studies. I've never found a written account of this, but I have a lot of respect for William Carey. He came up the Missouri River in 1861, and he came back in 1872. And I believe his artwork is pretty trustworthy. And I haven't ever read of an account where a bison and an elk tangled almost to a fatal state, but that's what he depicted. And here's another, I think, very unlikely scenario, but we have a mountain lion trying to kill a bison calf. I like finding these unusual engravings. That could have just been something hypothesized. I find that a lot in some of these pictures, especially there's a lot of artwork that I've collected that was printed in England, France, and Germany depicting the American West, printed in the 1800s. So a lot of these artists in Europe who were creating pictures were using their imagination as well as reading some of the accounts. So you never know for sure whether they're depicting something accurately. But I thought this picture presented something fairly truthful. Notice the rattlesnake down here. If a rattlesnake was to bite the leg of a bison, that would interfere with its ability to run quickly with the herd over long distances, for flight. So that could be not a healthy thing for a buffalo to get a rattlesnake bite in their leg. The prairie fires sometimes trapped bison, but their ability to run made it fairly unlikely that there'd be very many bison succumb to a prairie fire, as George Catlin suggests right here. I thought this was interesting. He even has one on fire. I don't know about that. And here's another, again, a picture showing the bison running from a prairie fire. I think this is somewhat improbable because I doubt they would just plunge right over a cliff. They would just maybe run a mile or half a mile or a mile or two away and wait and see what the flames were doing. I believe this one's in the exhibit. Here are two pictures, one by Charlie Russell and the other by Frederick Remington, showing Native Americans using fire to burn the grasses, to push bison in one direction, or to maybe keep bison from an enemy tribe, to try to create a desert between where they wanted the bison to be and an enemy tribe. But as we go more into the 21st century, I think the science world is beginning to realize how effectively and frequently that Native people used fire in the grasslands and in the forest lands to modulate nature. Water posed a hazard. Of course, they have to come to drink, and this looks fairly benign, but water courses held hazards to bison. For example, if they tried to cross a river that was ice-covered, the weight of the herd could make it crash through, which would drown quite a few of them, as suggested by George Catlin, who is not here in the winter. This is his hypothesized imagery. Here's another one by William Carey. Wolves could potentially gain an advantage if a bison crashed through the ice because the wolf would be light enough to not fall into the water, particularly could get to them. Here was probably a much more frequent hazard that is seldom understood: the ability to get out of the river. I floated the Missouri River. I bet you some of you Lewis and Clark folks have floated the Missouri River. Just out of curiosity, raise your hand if you floated the Missouri River. Yeah, there we go. Okay. You know there are cut banks along the Missouri River. So if a herd gets into the Missouri River, and if they float down too far from where they can get out, where there's a break in the coulee or this cut bank, they could be swept downstream and potentially drowned. I know there are accounts of hundreds and hundreds of bison carcasses rotting along riverbanks at times because of this phenomenon. They couldn't get out. You might think that weather would be a hard time for bison, but they are extremely well developed by natural selection and evolution to withstand North American winters. I think William T. Hornaday, who is very significant in the end of the story that you've probably all heard of, he wrote The Extermination of the American Bison. A buffalo can weather storms and outlive hunger and cold, which would kill any domestic steer that ever lived. And as an illustration of that, most cattle will turn their butt to the wind and drift with the wind. A bison will face the wind, I've been led to believe. And they use their heads to shovel away the snow. They're very well adapted to the rigors of North American winters, as opposed to cattle. And I love to collect poetry relating to the history of the American West. And lo, the herds, they come, a sweeping thundercloud of life, loud as Niagara and grand, as they who rode with plume and brand on Waterloo's red slope of strife. Wild as the rush of tidal waves that roar among their crags and caves, the trampling bison hurl along a black and bounding fiery mass that withers as with flame the grass. Oh, terrible, 10,000 strong. Bison in pre-horse days. All right, so obviously native people had travois that they could hitch up to dogs, but the amount of baggage they could carry was fairly small. So even though this method was used in horse days, pre-horse times, the Native Americans were able to create drive lines and pounds to surround and drive them into a pen. So you could make a pen of logs and stones of sufficient height and strength to hold the bison. And then you have either logs or stones or something on a long drive line. And you get the bison to come down through this funnel. And right here is where it's critical. So let's look at this example painted here in the 1830s. Right here was the critical point. Now you notice this isn't a tall cliff or anything. All you need is like a 5 or 10 foot slope. So how do you keep the bison in here? Oh, I read they have a really clever method. You make this slope out of logs facing, from top to bottom, and you put a lot of mud or excrement on it, and a bison then would slide down this incline, and then it's too difficult to get up because it's long logs going this way that have got a lot of slippery mud and manure on it. And so then down in here, these people right here would kill the bison that were trapped in the enclosure. So that was used for thousands of years before the American horse, the horse came back to the Americas. Now another favorite strategy was to dress up in a wolf skin and try to crawl as close as you could. And a number of artists picked up on that. So let's look at a few of these pictures. Here's Alfred Jacob Miller, who did this, who incidentally was the one and only artist to actually go to a mountain man rendezvous and create the artwork of it. All other depictions of the mountain man rendezvous were recreations from memory. This man actually visited the mountain man rendezvous. Whoops, oh no. Help, help, tech lady. Okay, let's see. All right, back again. Every speaker needs a young tech person, don't you think? Yeah, that's why I wanted her to be here.
Glad we got it back.
Okay, moving on. Again, another picture of this one by Carey. That was a very favorite method. Another method was to entrap the bison in deep snow when the native person was on snowshoes. And so we've got some examples of this. This is a Canadian artist who depicted it. And another picture here by Catlin. And we're pretty sure that Catlin, like so many artists, freely borrowed from other artists. So you notice this picture right here. Notice the Indians on the snowshoes. And go back one slide. Whoops, I'm sorry. Going forward, then this artist in Europe almost took the elements to create his own version of it. Can you see, whoops, I'm sorry. Can you see how that image by Catlin, who was probably borrowing the idea from Rindisbacher, so they're all just borrowing the ideas, whether or not they were there at the time. But I like that. So here is another way to effectively kill a bison, was to attack them when they're swimming across a river. This is another picture that's in my engraving show at Lolo State Park. I did mention that, didn't I? Go to Lolo State Park? Okay. A couple of times. Keep track, okay? Tell me at the end how many. Here is another example, again, of a European artist taking the same idea from the American artist. I actually had so many engravings of the American West depicted by European artists that I created my own traveling show called Viewed from Afar. And right now, I believe it's in Fort Morgan, Colorado. If any of you live in Colorado, you might want to swing through Fort Morgan and see it. But anyway, notice how the motif of this picture of like getting on the back and stabbing them and shooting them from canoes, look how that's pretty much a takeoff from this American view. But that's okay. All right. A bison jump or a pishkan provided a large amount of meat, and this is from First Peoples Buffalo Jump, up by Great Falls. The cliff height was not essential. I know when I was a kid, I thought, well, you just got to have this 50 or 100-foot cliff, You don't need anything that big. Literally, all you need is something far enough that they would break their leg when they fell or broke a bone, something that would incapacitate the animal when they hit the ground down below, and then they could be dispatched by arrows and spears by the warriors waiting down below. All right, here's another method. You have a bison jump ready, and you have what's called a caller who attempts to attract them. They're also aided by, sometimes the native people would get behind the herd and give a push, whereas this man was risking his life to create a pull. And so in native traditions, there were what were called the callers of buffalo. And I'm going to read to you a description by John Doherty, written in 1830. It's one paragraph. When the Indians determined to destroy bison in this way, meaning getting them to run over a cliff, one of their swiftest-footed and most active young men is selected, who is disguised in a bison skin, having the head, ears, and horns adjusted on his head, so as to make the deception very complete. And thus accoutred, he stations himself between the bison herd and some precipices that often extend for miles along the rivers. The Indians surround the herd as nearly as possible when, at a given signal, they show themselves and rush forward with loud yells. The animals, being alarmed and seeing no way open but in the direction of the disguised Indian, run towards him, and he, taking flight, dashes to the precipice where he suddenly secures himself in some previously ascertained crevice. In other words, he gets the herd to start running toward him, and then he hides right at the edge of the cliff in some little depression. The foremost of the herd arrives at the brink. There is no possibility of retreat, no chance of escape. The foremost may for an instant shrink with terror, but the crowd behind, who are terrified by the approaching hunters, rush forward with increasing impetuosity, and the aggregated force hurls them successively into the gulf, where certain death awaits them. Isn't that a pretty magnificent description? I love the way they wrote in the 19th century about their experiences. So here are some on the drive lines, and here they are going over the top, where the women usually wait at the bottom to do the skinning and the dressing of the meat. Here's the buffalo side up by Havre, and it shows bison were run over the cliff there for over a 2,000-year period. I've been there. It's really fantastic. It's just on the north edge of Havre. Raise your hand if you've actually been to that bison jump. You really should go to these, the one by Great Falls and the one up by Havre. It's impressive. Another impressive one is head smashed in buffalo jump in Alberta. That's really neat. You've been there, I can tell. You've been there. And it's a fantastic museum. It goes up about 5 levels. And another way to kill bison besides running them over a cliff, I think this is a very clever endeavor called the arroyo trap method. What you basically do is get the bison to run up into an arroyo and have it end somewhere, or you barricade it, and then the native people on the edge can then dispatch the bison. And I got some pictures coming that show this. In fact, over 10,000 years ago, in Wild Horse Arroyo in New Mexico, 23 bison were trapped in this arroyo and killed by humans with the what is known as the Folsom spear points. So 10,000 years ago, they were employing this device. And here's a really neat picture by John Clymer showing that. In the 1970s, archaeologists discovered at the iron mill site in southeastern Montana that over 10,000 years ago, the natives dispatched 30 buffalo with that method. So it's a very ingenious method. You don't need a big cliff, you just need to be able to trap them. And here's another one I have not been to. It's like a big circular depression, a cone in the prairie, And they have found that the native people were running buffalo over the edge and killing them at the bottom. And there's literally thousands of bones to testify to that. Again, Mr. Carey is showing us an image which I think is problematic. I don't know about you, but you'd have to be awfully brave to try to run down a bison on foot. I do not recommend that for your health. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. Maybe some brave told him that he did that. All right, the early art of the American bison. Well, this is the first known engraving by a Spanish artist. And for hundreds of years, a lot of these depictions were done by artists who'd never really seen the American bison in real life. This is the oldest, one of the older pictures I have in my exhibit down in Lolo. Did I mention I had an exhibit down there? Does that look like a bison or more like a cow? Looks more like a cow, doesn't it? That'll be on the first picture on your left when you come in. And here's a German one. I think has a little more sense of reality to it. But I got some better ones coming. How about that one? And here comes the best one. Whoa. These Europeans, they had quite an imagination. They were trying. Grrr. I bought this lithograph. I find it hard to believe that this artist knew very much. For starters, Indians don't waste their arrows shooting in the hump of the buffalo. Secondly, they didn't have recurved bows. Okay. Thirdly, the North American Indians didn't wear South American clothing. And generally, they were more lean and muscular than these two fellows suggest. So it's fun picking apart these pictures. Is this one in Travelers Rest? I can't remember. It wasn't. All right, the first American artist to actually see a buffalo on the high plains and paint it was Titian Ramsey Peale. He was an artist who went on Stephen Long's expedition to what is now the Colorado Rockies. And with him came Samuel Seymour. So those are the first pictures that I can find of American artists, not European or whatever, who actually saw the American bison on the high plains and returned with pictures of it. I think that's a really beautiful one. That's the earliest one I can find. All right, the centrality of the bison in Plains Indian culture, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, so we'll kind of look at some of the details. This is reminiscent of a sign you have down there at Travelers Rest listing almost everything that is usable by the native people from the bison. They can use about everything except the roar. They have a display down there showing this. The arrival of the horse back into the Americas after a 10,000-year hiatus gave the native people a great advantage in hunting bison. And we all know that the horse spread slowly in the 1600s and northward into the 1700s into the northern plains. The horse enabled them to vastly increase their ability to kill the bison, to transfer their products, and to utilize it more effectively. It really allowed their culture to reach a high degree of life. Here's an image showing them drying the bison meat right after the hunt. You could make teepee skins with the bison hides. You could make warm robes with the bison hides. Here's a Charlie Russell picture showing the women who are following the hunters who are chasing the herds, because it was generally the woman's responsibility to tan the hide. They did brain tanning, and it was a very laborious, backbreaking process. And here's one of the implements that would help them do that, an elkhorn scraper. This looks like metal to me, but you could also use bone or stone on the tip of that, which they obviously did for thousands of years before the white man arrived with metal. A vertical scaffold. This artist did live among the Sioux for a while, so I presume he saw that, but I don't see that happen very often. Most likely, they were doing it on the ground. And in case you might think, you know, this is not very kind to the women folk to have to do this backbreaking work. But think in white culture, we had a lot of women in sweatshops for a long, long time at very poor conditions for poor wages. So I don't think we can cast too much criticism on them for making the women tan the hides. Here's one of the uses. You could make boats. Down in Travelers Rest, they have a recreation of a bull boat that it's one hide, and you take a wood about, say, as thick as your thumb or maybe a little thicker when it's green, and you can bend it into a bow and create this effect. And you can float across the river. I believe I have a picture. This is not the one at Lolo, but do go down and see the original one at Lolo. They have it in the middle of the bison exhibit. But it was very effective. It was waterproof. It lacked a keel, though, so I think it would be a little hard to paddle very far, but it would get you across a river dry. And I suppose you could pull it across if you had a long enough cord. Here's another use of bison products. Making a shield. The neck skin of a bull was extremely tough, and that's what they used to make a shield. The hide was also a surface for which you could paint designs, create your history. They often had what's called a winter count. I believe I have that coming on the next slide. You could tell the history of your people by putting one symbol or two symbols for a given year and keep it going. So each one of these drawings here represents something significant that happened to that individual or to the tribe, to the clan, as a memory of their history. I believe that chromolithograph is in my exhibit down in Lolo. Did I mention that before? All right. The horse created a problem as well as the white man in general, because white pressure, you know, from the east of the Mississippi was pushing tribal people westward. And as tribes moved westward, they were encountering the native people that were already there. And there were historically native people on the west side of the divide who had come over the mountains to harvest bison products east of the divide. So there was this was a real pressure point of contention for tribes, the ones that were being pushed westward, the ones that were already there, and the ones that had historically come over the divide from the west. So that created a lot of hunting pressure on those tribes. I found this map, it's quite interesting. The darker it is, the greater the density of bison. And I think that comes to, this could be for two reasons. One would be the plentiful rainfall. And over here and over here, it's somewhat a little more dry. This is more sagebrushy country. But this is still, the whole eastern Montana is really good bison range. I was told by a biologist from the University of Montana that although we know bison were west of the divide, as you've seen from the earlier part of my description, the grasses were not as nutrient on the west side of the divide, according to my biology friend. So even though they were on that side of the divide, this was the heart of the really rich bison country in the northern plains. So not only was there people coming over to hunt the bison from the east of the divide, they were also bringing their, sometimes they were bringing salmon and other trade goods, products that they had over here that were not available to the high plains tribes. I believe you're going to have one of your programs, one of your outings is going to be going up on this so-called road to the bison that went up the Clark Fork and the Blackfoot River. And I think you should take advantage of that. This is part of the road that they followed over the divide. This was, I thought, a very telling painting by Charlie Russell. It's in enemy country. And I read the description of it. First of all, you notice these men are walking. They're not sitting up high on their horses. They have buffalo robes over them. And they're trying to walk right close to the middle of the bison. So from a mile or two away, if an enemy would see them, they would think that they were bison and not human beings intruding onto their hunting territory. The Blackfeet were not entirely welcoming to other tribes coming to the bison ranges of their territory. So they had to try some subterfuges, these tribes that were coming from the west side of the divide. Another way to avoid the Blackfeet was to go over the Yellowstone Plateau. So like the Bannock had a route going over the Yellowstone Plateau, crossing the Yellowstone River at Bannock Ford. And I've got here's a ranger who scouted this route out back in the early 1900s. And I've hiked some of these trails here. These are my photographs. I was fortunately able to go to Bannock Pass, which is where they would come over. And since they only could travel, like say 15, 20 miles a day, there are still wiki-ups remnant from the bison days when they were going across the Yellowstone Plateau. And here's where they crossed the Yellowstone River. This is the Tower Junction over here. So it's just right upstream from Tower. And they crossed right here because the river got really wide and they could ford the river right there. The bison, of course, being central to their lifeways, entered into their mythology and their religion. And so they honored the bison and they had dances to propitiate them. I believe this is supposed to be a Crow tribe doing that by Frederick Remington. Here's another one of a Canadian tribe that is dancing to honor the buffalo and to hope that they bring them back. And as far south as New Mexico, we have this picture by Richard Kern showing that these people in Zuni also danced to honor the buffalo. Catlin was a cynic. He spent quite a bit of time with the Native Americans on the upper Missouri River, and he noticed they would dance and dance and danced until a crier came back and said the bison were near. And from the Native point of view, their dancing and their supplications brought the bison nearby, but in Catlin's cynical view, they danced until the bison appeared. And here is a bison pile painted by Carl Bodmer, who came up the Missouri River a year after Catlin did, showing how much they honored them and how they wanted to use them as a boundary marker and to honor them and to pay their respects to the life-giving nature of the bison. And here's a picture I took down in Utah of a bison calf inside the cow calf that was part of a rock art. Well, as time progressed, the native people began, using bison hides. They did beaver hides too, but bison hides to trade with the white men for the white man goods that they couldn't manufacture. And this led to a dependency on the manufactured goods, which was not the best thing for them, in that it made them want to kill more and more bison in order to trade for knives, guns, kettles, and those implements, which they found very useful. Yes, and blankets, yes. Although the bison robe was plenty warm. So there was a shift between the subsistence economy and a market economy, because with steamboats starting in the 1860s going up and down the Missouri River, you could ship literally thousands and thousands and tons of bison hides. Whereas, for example, beaver hides could be pressed and carried on horseback or on wagons back east. That was pretty difficult to do over long distances with the heavy bison hides. All right, let's look at the bison hunting methods with the horse. Let me grab a little drink here. So you remember toward the beginning, I pointed out a bison drive and a pen down there. So with the horse, that would facilitate the driving the bison into the pens where they could be killed. So that helped. But simply attacking the bison on horseback and shooting the bison became the favored method. Charlie Russell loved to paint the bison hunt, and he did it more than 40 times. This is one of my favorite Charlie Russell bison hunting pictures. Well, you know that I was criticizing that European artist for showing Indians shooting arrows into the hump of the bison, which would do nothing to it. What you try to do is you put an arrow into the rib cage to go into the lungs, and then it would bleed to death. Quite often the blood would come streaming out of their mouths. That's where you need to hit the bison, right there in the rib cage behind the forefeet. And even if the bison didn't drop as they tried to flee, they would still expire maybe a mile or two away, but their hours, their minutes were numbered once they got an arrow through their rib cage into their lungs. The white man's flintlock rifle was inferior to the native bow because it was too difficult in this, as you can see here in this picture by Frederick Remington. You had to put a charge in here. You had to put a ball down the gun, and it was just too much when you were running. I've read that a native person could run along a buffalo and could probably shoot arrows every 5 seconds or so. You can't do that with a flintlock gun. Repeating rifles, yes, later, but not the early flintlocks. So bison hunting was the favorite image of Western artists. So let's cruise through a few of these. As I was saying, the bow and arrow was the most effective. Occasionally, an arrow would go right through the bison. I've read stories where that actually could happen. Another thing that was good about hunting with an arrow was quite often the arrow feathers were individualized. So if the bison ran a ways and then expired, we could tell whose arrow shot into it. So that helped in the identification. The lance was also effective in this painting by Frederick Remington, as you can see here. And the Mexicans were expert with their lances. And I don't know if you remember, but when I was showing that picture back in the beginning of the program, they were using lances to go after bison. They were very expert at using the lance, the Mexicans were. And here's an image showing that. Don't you just love Charlie Russell's paintings? Yes. When a bison herd was located, a society of the males would make sure that nobody went prematurely out against the herd. They did not want the herd to be alarmed and to run away before everybody in the tribe had their fair chance. So a society of men would strictly regulate. It wasn't just a free-for-all. Oh, there's bison out there, let's go get them. No, they organized their hunt very effectively so that once the signal was given that the chase was on, that everybody had a fair chance of riding up and getting making an individual kill. So it was not just a free-for-all. It was very closely and effectively regulated by mutual consent of the warriors. Now, the bison cow meat was much more delicious and tender than the bull meat. Too many white men shot bulls only to discover that the meat was very tough and stringy and not that tasty. So the cows were what you wanted to shoot for meat. But think of it, you're killing the cows that reproduce the calves, so you're at odds. The fact that native people were able to kill probably over the 10,000 years, killed millions of buffalo cows, and this herd still thrived. Tells you that they had a balance between the number they were killing and the number that the cows were able to give as calves. This is a very interesting picture, again by my favorite artist, no, it isn't, it's by O.C. Darley. This is actually a native person because I've read the text that went with it. Native people often incorporated some of their white men clothing into their dress. This hunter has just been a part of a buffalo hunt, and the calf had its mother killed. Quite often, the calf would follow the horse of the hunters back to camp, kind of like, you know, an imprinting effect with, like, say, ducks do. A good buffalo horse, one that knew how to approach the buffalo, pardon me, that could approach it, keep the rider just where he wanted, and make sure the horse could stay away from the horns, because the bison would often, you know, try to hook the horns into the belly of the horse. A good buffalo running horse was highly valued. So here we have an example of what you don't want to have happen, where the bison were able to upset the horse. That is bad news. As is shown here by Frederick Remington. As is shown here by this individual. As is shown here by this man on snowshoes. It's a favorite motif, isn't it? I'm very proud of the fact that the original engraving of this I was able to purchase. This is by George Catlin. It's a very large painting, a print. It's about this big. And it shows what is called the surround. This was often done. You encircle a band. You know, a band was anywhere from 50 to a couple of hundred or so bison. You surround it, and then you slowly constrict the perimeter of it. And if any bison try to run away, you kill it and make sure it doesn't lead the others to safety. And you basically continue surrounding it and constricting the ring of warriors and hunters, and they generally kill every bison. And then the women move in and process the meat, and that usually can keep a whole band of people, 50 or 100 people through the winter. Oh. And that original is in Lolo, Montana at the Traveler's Rest. It's big and beautiful, isn't it, Galen? Yeah. It's one of my best pictures in the exhibit. Here's the head smashed in buffalo jump showing, here's where the bison might graze, and you put your drive lines up, these white lines, and then try to get them to go over the cliffs over in this area. So, again, this is what I grew up with. You know, they had to plunge over hundreds of feet. No, they didn't really need to. But it makes for a dramatic picture, doesn't it? And here's a Trolley Russell picture showing that. Lewis and Clark noticed one on the Missouri River near today's Arrow Creek, and they said it stank pretty much. I presume you Lewis and Clark people have read about that. This is problematic because, you know, they're not, the bison just wouldn't run over a cliff. They have to be, there has to be some kind of drive line usually. For example, like in this picture, you generally have to funnel them, get them running really, really fast. But with a horse, that was much more feasible. Now here's a picture by Frederick Remington. I haven't read about this in my history books here. But I think this would be effective. Again, you're mimicking the sight of a buffalo, and you have the robe over it, so hopefully it hides your scent, and you could get closer to them. This painting, which by the way is down at the Buffalo Bill Center for the West in Cody, Wyoming, was entered in the 1889 Paris exhibition, The Last of the Buffalo, and they rejected it. They felt it was too German. I mean, can't you see this is kind of employing European mythological action? And it's suggesting that the bison were being exterminated by the Indians, which is not the case. Euro-Americans were mostly responsible for the extermination of the bison. So that was not a fair title for that picture. Because as we know, the white hunters accelerated the slaughter of the bison, the destruction of the bison. Let's look at a map showing what the Oregon Trail or the Overland Trail did, as suggested by this Charlie Russell picture. You know, you can see the wagon train in the background, and here's a white hunter out for meat. The Overland Trail basically went from Missouri through the Platte River country, and then it split. Part of it went to California, and part of it went up to Oregon territory. And this pressure of hunting along the Overland Trail split them into the northern herd and the southern herd. So many of the wagon trains that went west, the people along it wanted to hunt a buffalo. And by the way, this is a little side note here. There aren't, you know, out in the middle of the prairie, there aren't trees, but a buffalo chip, a dried buffalo bun, actually made a pretty decent fire. I've never done it myself. Raise your hand if you've ever had a buffalo dung fire. Did it work very well?
Yeah, reasonably well.
Okay.
It has a very distinct odor.
A distinct odor. Did it get into the food? The white men found, though, that bison were dangerous, you don't want your horse to fall over. You want to be careful and not approach a bison on foot too much. I read a story I mentioned here that one buffalo skinner was gored to death. He thought he had killed the buffalo and he was cutting the tongue out, and it rose up and horned him to death. So you better stay on your horse or from a place of safety. And this is a story by Alfred Jacob Miller on his wagon train to the Mountain Man Rendezvous. They liked to buffalo hunt, but it was very dangerous. Here you can see a buffalo charging against Mr. Stewart, who was getting ready to jump onto his horse. One of the members of their party loved to tease the bison, and he would get off his horse sometimes and actually act like a Spanish matador. He was actually killed by a bison bull. I don't think that's very healthy or likely. And here's a European, this is a French picture, who thought an Indian would jump on the back of a bison to kill him. They had imaginations, didn't they, as I've been letting you know. They were slaughtered for sport. You shoot them and just let them lie there, or maybe go cut the tongue off, or at the very most, the head for a mount. It was a favorite sport among the aristocracy of Europe to come to America and go on a buffalo hunt. Here is the Grand Duke Alexis killing a bison. Buffalo Bill Cody supposedly had a contest with Billy Comstock, and in one day to see how many bison they could kill. I'm not sure this is a true story. It could be apocryphal, but it does suggest the wanton slaughter that was socially acceptable by white hunters. One of the most egregious visitors was Sir George Gore. He came on a 3-year buffalo hunt, or not just buffalo, just wild animal hunt, 2,000 bison, 1,600 deer, and 105 bears he killed. The native people watching this were not very pleased. Oops. By Mr. Gore. There were actually excursions on the Kansas Pacific Railroad where they would advertise, come on a buffalo shoot, and they would stop the train or slow the train down to allow the visitors to shoot out the windows or to get off the train and shoot buffalo. This was madness. It was just a total slaughter or waste. But the worst is yet to come. Again, here's a French version of it. Down here, slaughtered for the hide. All right, here is the coup de grace. They invented in the 1870s a chemical solution that would allow the tanning of the hide to be processed very efficiently and quickly. And they used these buffalo hides to create belts to run the machinery in eastern machinery factories. And so this this drove up the demand for hides. They were only going to get like $2 or $3 a hide, but you brought in then white men, generally 4 to 5 men, 1 or 2 sharpshooters, and they'd have 2 guns who would set up and start shooting. If the barrel got too hot, they would switch to the other gun, and they began a murderous slaughter of the bison herd. Do you remember me talking about how you would, let's go back to this one, you would kill the lead cow, because if the lead cow tried to lead the band away, they would shoot the lead cow. If another buffalo tried to leave the band, they would shoot that one. They would be generally shooting 50 to 100 or more bison in one stand. And then they'd bring in their the other members of the team, the skinners, who would then have the responsibility of skinning the hides. It was a terrible business. I believe this is a Frederick Remington picture in my exhibit. So it required a party of men to carry out this deadly, dirty business of killing the bison and making the hides so that they could ship them off to the east to be tanned efficiently. Hauled by the railroads then. The stench on the prairies was horrendous. Don't shoot, my good fellow. Here, take my robe, save your ammunition, let me go in peace. There were demands repeatedly given to Congress to do something to stop the slaughter of the buffalo, but it was understood. It was never really an official policy. It was just something that white people in general realized that if you could kill the food source of the native people, then you would be more likely to drive them onto their reservations. So there was no moral compunction, and there was no legal restrictions ever placed upon the hunt until near the very end. And so this is William Hornaday's map showing the original red boundary of the bison, and they shrank and shrank and shrank until the last herds were killed in Montana and in northern Texas. I believe this beautiful big map is in my exhibit. And we're running near the end of my program here. Native people in the south, in the southern herd, fought against some of the buffalo hide hunters. The Army came back and effectively checked them. And so we're getting near the end of the story of the buffalo in my talk. And William T. Hornaday, who wrote The Extermination of the Bison, came out to Montana and killed some specimens to take back to the Smithsonian. And I'm pleased to let you know, and probably a lot of you people already know, that those were taken back to Fort Benton and are on display at the museum there in Fort Benton. Notice that orientation is the exact same thing you can see there now. The aftermath. Conjuring did not bring the buffalo back. All you could do was gather the bones. The bones were used in the making of sugar and of fertilizer. And so there were parties that would go out and gather up the bison bones. Even native people gathered up some of the bones in order to get a few dollars for subsistence. The carnage was just awful. That is horrific. That is a solid pile of bison skulls. There must be tens of thousands of bison skulls in that pile. Does that make you cry? All that was left was buffalo chips, and even then, those disappeared. And they tried to bring back the bison by the ghost dance. Did not work. Even when they were on reservations, they were sometimes given live beef allotments as part of their annuity programs for seeding their lands. And sometimes the natives would turn the cow loose and then chase it like in the old buffalo days and shoot the cow and skin it. And we do know that the bison were saved from extinction, and that's another story. And I'm finishing 2 or 3 minutes early, and I'll be glad to take questions.
Great timing. We have time for questions. Yes, right here.
The bison that were in California after the Columbia Basin disappeared before the white men came there.
Okay. My guess is there weren't very many of them, that it would be relatively easy to tip the balance between hunting and birth, you know, the natural death rate, the hunting kill rate, and the birth rate. My guess is there wasn't enough of them or enough good forage, or for some ecological reason, the herd wasn't big enough to sustain that.
Because
Okay.
I've seen a buffalo jump in the state of Washington. It's a small one.
Mhm.
There are bones there.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, Dan Flores said that when the Indians, horses, before the white men got out there, that they pretty rapidly killed off the buffalo on that western part.
I will say that Dan Flores is an academic professional, and he knows 10 times more about the history of the bison than I do. So some of these specific questions you might want to ask him tonight, but he has written the book American Serengeti, and he's got a new one coming out. He'll be speaking tonight.
The New West is out.
The New West is out?
Yeah.
Okay. His new book. So those would be good questions for him, too. As you can see, I'm really fascinated with the art of the American bison. You didn't get too many facts and figures, but you got a lot of beautiful art, didn't you?
Do we have any other questions? Yes.
So the terminology, bison, buffalo, how did that come about?
The bison is the scientific name and buffalo is the common name. So when I grew up, it was buffalo. That's what probably most people still call it. But the buffalo is a name applied to Asian species and African species too, you know, like the Cape buffalo. And so it's more of a common name versus a scientific name.
I could just speak to that. I've helped manage a herd of bison. We believe they're called buffalo because of the French called them le boeuf, and then the Spanish called them buffalo. So they would have known, you know, the Asian species, and so when it came to North America, they just associated them to be the same.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah,
They are related.
very distantly.
They're close.
Right.
Any other questions? Yes.
Just a point, I work Buffalo Heights for a living, or I try to, and I did bring a 1872 Buffalo Road, if you want to feel what the real native done ones, not the European done ones, are like. I'm supposed to be doing, Billy Maxwell, I'm doing a round table this afternoon, so
Okay.
I'll bring that out. So if you want to come by and try it on, take a picture with it.
Okay.
Just, check yourself afterwards for headlines.
Okay. And don't forget to go to Travelers Rest to see the exhibit. Did I mention that?
Any other questions? Yes.
Tonight, a meal going with the presentation
Tonight?
this evening.
Yes, there's a meal tonight with the program concluding that will be Dan Flores speaking
So where is that gonna be held?
in the ballroom. Here.
Right here?
And this,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, I was with my wife, who's now dead, but, about 20 years ago, we were up by Fort Robinson in, western,
Nebraska.
yeah, Nebraska. And, driving out of the Fort area, which was, now is a campground, but that back then, that's where they killed crazy horse and all that. But anyway, there was a whole herd of these buffalo on the, the domes out there, feasting on the grass. Now, there weren't thousands of anything like that, but there was more than 10 or 20. And they were very tame. You could drive amongst them.
And just in today's newspaper, you might have noticed that the Blackfoot have released wild bison on their reservation today or yesterday. Read about it in the newspaper.
Okay, well, let's thank Lee for such a great presentation. And the Trail Heritage Foundation would like to give you a small gift.
Oh, thank you.
A leather keychain.
Oh, thank you.
To help you remember your day here, and we certainly will. And I have one last thing. You're all interested in bison, and you probably all are also interested in one of our chroniclers of Lewis and Clark, and that's Ken Burns. Well, this fall on PBS, his documentary on the American buffalo will come out. It just says fall
It's
2023.
It's October 16th and 17th on PBS. 2 hours on the 16th and 2 hours on the 17th. And don't forget,
I hadn't heard the time.
yeah, don't forget to get a bibliography and come up and look at some of my sample books here. Thank you.